Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. J. Simon Rofe, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the University of London's Knowledge, Diplomacy and Climate Change event this afternoon. I have the pleasure, indeed honour, of chairing this afternoon's discussion. We're welcoming three wonderful speakers to our seminar under the banner of knowledge, diplomacy and climate change. Those of you who may have joined us on Wednesday looked at the prospects of knowledge, diplomacy and the current pandemic and began a conversation that was both equally fascinating and stimulating and prompted, as good academic discussion should, at least as many questions as it did provide answers. So to that end, I'll get things moving. We're joined by three colleagues here today. Felicia Jackson, a colleague of mine at SOAS, University of London, who has extensive experience in sustainable work. We have Francis Wood, also, and then from the FCDO, and then Dr. Mathieu Denis, the Science Director of the International Science Council. So we're going to ask each of them to speak for a few moments. I believe they each have a few slides to move us along. We would very much welcome questions from the audience. We have a Q&A facility here, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, as our current predicament has seen us upskill in the use of Zoom and Teams and other formats. So please do feel free to add questions as you go. We will collate them and provide our panelists with an opportunity to speak to them as we move forward. Again, just very many thanks for joining us. And this is a part of a bigger project that I and colleagues have been working on, and we're very much looking forward to this opportunity. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask my colleague Felicia to give an insight from her perspective into knowledge, diplomacy and climate change. Felicia, if I may pass over to you.
So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm very excited to be part of this conversation, as knowledge diplomacy, I think, has an almost unique role to play in the way in which we can address climate change. One of the things that came up in the introduction to this session was this idea that the consensus that exists among scientists around climate change, about the origins and the long-term risks, doesn't necessarily and hasn't to date really translated into a consensus amongst diplomats about what they should do, what the appropriate course of action is. And obviously that's raised questions. You know, is science contributing in the right way? Is knowledge diplomacy, does knowledge diplomacy have a role to play in climate change? Well, at SOAS, we set up a thing called the Sustainable Data Finance Initiative, or SOFINDA, which came at this from a completely different point of view. Our view on this was that, you know, the science is pretty much established. We understand the mechanisms, we understand what's going on. We learn more every year about how things are changing, where we are on tipping points, the impacts that climate change can have. But as a general rule, the mechanisms are well understood and accepted. This really is a problem of politics. It's a problem of worldviews, and fundamentally, it's a problem of how we understand economics. So our position on this was that policymakers make decisions not based on science, but based on a combination of scientific knowledge, political necessity, economic priorities, and obviously, you know, domestic concerns. The things that underpin that are things like how you work out your cost-benefit analysis, how you identify economic impact. And of course, you know, with the big issue coming up at COP26 this November, the issue of climate finance. So the challenge of responsibility and equity in sharing the financial burden. Now, the approach we took was that the biggest problem we have is that while the teaching of economics is evolving, it's not, the understanding of that evolution is not necessarily being shared equally around the world. And one of the biggest challenges there is in those countries where the most important need for knowledge is, the biggest drive for knowledge about the importance of valuing nature, about understanding the value of the ecosystem underpinning economic activity, hasn't necessarily been integrated into everyday discussions. So there may be debate about what's an effective form of technology transfer and, you know, what's the best way to mitigate emissions. But when you've got an advisor from a developed economy saying to a 60-year-old minister in the energy world, in a coal-fired dominated country, well, you need to start doing solar power instead of coal-fired power. What's going to drive that acceptance, that understanding that there's a benefit to that? It's very, very difficult to affect change if people don't see how that change is going to benefit them, and if it isn't explained in a language that makes sense to them. And this is a huge issue around economics overall, actually. If you think about it, traditional economics, classical economics, it's all based on this idea of the rational actor. You've got ideas around market efficiency, and you've got effectively the sort of neoliberal order that's pretty much dominated discourse in the last 20, 30 years. There are new fields of economics. You've got behavioral economics, you've got game theory, you've got asymmetrical information, lots and lots of theories. But my point is, they're all a bunch of theories. They're focused very much within universities. There isn't necessarily that translation to the outside world. So what we've seen, I would say, in the last couple of decades anyway, with climate change, with understanding of the impact of climate change on functional operations of the ecosystem and therefore of the economy, because if you've got supply chain problems, if you've got resource scarcity, these have knock-on effects, and that can be from the most basic things like health and poverty all the way through to responsible consumption, how you actually operate your businesses. But economics is really about it's about management of the economy. And where we sort of came at this was, there is an element of economics that is much more fundamental, and that's finance. It's understanding how finance works. So I've just realized I've completely ignored my slides. So what we actually started to think about was, how do we use the knowledge we have to change the way in which people think about finance, about how to invest, to realign capital towards a more sustainable, towards a low carbon economic framework. And the way you actually do this is through changing the way in which people are taught economics, changing the way in which people are taught finance. There's huge amounts of work being done on externalities, the impact of climate risk. In the developed world, the private sector has really, to a certain extent, got further ahead. Many investors now take very seriously the concept of future-proofing their investments and ensuring that they are at least dealing with the question of how they're going to manage emissions. They're looking at their impact on water. They're looking at their impact on pollution. And this is creating a financial process. There's accounting standards being developed around it, investment lenses like ESG. It's a completely different way of looking at how you justify an investment, which is what it's all about. So at the Sustainable Finance Data Initiative, we actually had a very, very big picture idea, which is build up the data available on investment. But within that, there was an absolutely fundamental element, was we have to change the way in which education about finance works. So the way in which we looked at doing this was to start out with training. So we looked at, these are various different areas that actually need to be affected, need to change. You need to understand the economics of the energy transition. You need to understand the cost of different policy choices, but also the potential of green growth, why particular choices are to your benefit, to the benefit of the country. All of these different elements came together, and our theory of change was, if we can provide this academic training and change the way in which people not only understand finance and economics, but also teach it, you start to build up a network of experts in local universities, which can then turn around and train local policymakers, local bankers. We have a lot of work being done in capacity building, which sees, international consultants will go to a country, they will run a program, everybody ticks a box. That's not how you affect the change you need to make. So our theory was, if we change the way in which people are taught to think about these things, we change worldviews, that means you have a fundamentally different baseline and worldview within which people are prepared to accept different sorts of solutions to problems. So that was our theory around why this is such an important contribution to climate diplomacy. Now, as it worked out, the larger database actually didn't get funding. But we went ahead and we ran a pilot project, actually training academics. Oh, that's the database project, but I'll run through this because I think I'm running out of time. This is really what we wanted to do. You build the local hub, you build outreach, you develop this understanding of what the potential is, everything from the local impact of mobile banking and access to credit, all the way through to, you know, the valuation of the rainforest, depending on how you want to do it. The idea being, if you can teach people how to think about value differently, you actually leapfrog a lot of the mistakes that have been made in the way in which our extractive economic models have basically destroyed a lot of the resources and the ecosystems within which we function. We did the pilot with 6 universities, which was very interesting. Everyone was very excited about it. It couldn't have happened at a worse time, obviously, because COVID was kicking off and there were some challenges. But in the end, what we found was that there are specific challenges that I think are universal across knowledge exchange programs. And I could be wrong, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But there were a mixture of operational and sort of conceptual challenges. In terms of what we wanted to achieve, everyone was aligned. There was a real excitement about the potential, interest in the opportunity, but there were structural issues around time zones and ensuring there were real-time discussions, because access problems, digital access was a huge problem. Access to data. Now, I mean that in terms of available databases and local access to journals that need it, that were required for the coursework, but also actually fundamental gaps in existing data, which is a real challenge. The commitment and engagement was an issue. That's partly COVID. I think it's also partly that, to an extent, there were a couple of people from each university that came onto the course, but not necessarily the people who had engaged with the concept of the program. And of course, it's a lot of extra work on top of what they're doing anyway. So I think there are ways in which commitment and engagement needs to be improved. Integration within the universities. We were working almost without exception with specialist centres within the universities. So dealing with politics, dealing with who's brought what idea in at the university level was particularly challenging in actually turning that around and turning the learning that they had outward into the university. Turnover is a challenge. A number of people who did the course last year have already left. Now, on one level, that's great if people take their knowledge with them. But I think that there was further embedding of the knowledge that was required before that was going to be a useful element. And then priorities. Obviously, there's always different priorities within every university. So I think a wider engagement would have been more useful. And of course, funding, because that is always a challenge for everybody. We actually ended up running the pilot unfunded, which was a huge amount of pressure on everybody involved. And while it was effective, I think we learned more about what didn't work than what did. Which is,
Felicia, if I may just,
sorry, is it time for you to stop?
Sum up. Yeah, I'm afraid.
Sorry, I always talk too much. Anyway, basically there it is. I think knowledge and information and skills about finance are probably one of the most important change levers for the ability for climate negotiators to be able to look at potential solutions. And I will sign off.
Thank you so much, Felicia. I think that contribution is very valuable to understanding how we can make change in an environment where perhaps change hasn't been so evident previously. So thank you very much for that. I'd like now to turn to colleague Frances Wood from the British Embassy in Berlin. Frances.
Thank you very much, Simon. I will just share my screen. I think I'll take quite a different approach to Felicia on this. So I am a practitioner, so I'm a diplomat. I have worked on climate change in many different roles, including being the first head of climate security in the UK's Foreign Ministry, and I'll come to that a bit later. I would say that this is not necessarily the most cohesive presentation, but it is some thoughts that I hope will elicit some questions and discussion shortly. So just to really set the context a little bit, so many of you will be aware that the UK is co-hosting COP26 this November with Italy, and these are the not unambitious objectives that we are trying to achieve in that. And I think it's just important to sort of note how much of that requires knowledge to deliver. And then I will go a little bit into the science objectives. So very much the approach that the UK government is taking is we have these headline objectives, but under that we see that science absolutely has to underpin, otherwise we're not going to achieve that, we're not going to deliver the emissions reduction. And a lot of what you see here in these objectives are echoed in some of the things that Felicia has already said. So it's about making the case, it's about using science to build public and government support. It's about using evidence to inform policy making, so making the right choices. But there's a really big piece here about the building the skills and capacity in order to be able to deliver that. I just want to sort of maybe take a step back from this year's COP. So I have been in the Foreign Ministry now for longer than I might care to admit, so around 15 years. And for me, just seeing the sort of evolution of the type of knowledge that has been needed for this debate has been really interesting. So, I mean, this is going back before I started, but it was interesting that it was in the 1980s that the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, employed the first civil servants or instructed them to start working on climate change. And very much from then until I think the sort of early 2000s, very much the focus on what knowledge was very much sort of climate science and what will the physical impacts of climate change be. But I think around sort of 2006, there was a bit of a shift of sort of, well, you know, if we accept the climate science, if we accept what the physical impacts of climate change will be, what will then be the impact on our economy? And so I think there was a pivotal report here in the Stern Review in the UK, which was the first real attempt to think about systemically what will be the impact from climate change on our economy. And at the time, you know, there was lots of criticism about the modelling and how accurate it was. But just in terms of how you use knowledge, for me, it was really interesting, sort of, for me, the first time that you apply the sort of climate change with the economics. And then was sort of, my role was created within the Foreign Ministry, which was to run a climate security team, which was at that sort of cusp again of thinking, okay, if we accept the physical impacts of climate change, what will then be the security risks of this? And there was the first UN Security Council debate that the UK put forward in 2007, and then the work that sort of I started. And it was really interesting working on something that was so new, because there was very little academic work in the field. There was very little evidence to say that there was a security risk from climate change. And actually a lot of concern from academia at the time around securitization, militarization. And so as a practitioner, you had to tread quite carefully in order to not have the negative sides of connecting these two issues. But essentially what we were trying to do was to get a different set of people to think about climate change when they assess risk. So for me, sort of the people that I was talking to was a lot of defence ministries around the world. So when they were making assessments about threats to their countries, that they weren't just thinking about other countries or sort of particular non-state actors, but they were also thinking about climate change. And interestingly, there was also sort of initial discussions with the insurance sector. So linking back to Felicia's point about finance, that it was really important about that risk assessment. So, you know, is this, you know, can we provide insurance in this case? And getting, you know, some of the insurance companies to start thinking about factoring climate change into that risk assessment. And for me now, I think where that sort of evolution of knowledge has got to is and you know, I admit there is still a lot of skepticism about climate change, and we probably could have a whole 3-hour discussion about whether people accept that. But I think now, certainly in the kind of Western world, there is an acceptance of the sort of science for solutions. So how can we use knowledge to solve the problem, rather than sort of endlessly going round of, well, we need more knowledge in order to accept that this is a problem. I think I will come later on to some of the challenges that still remain, but I just thought that taking that sort of step back and looking at the evolution of the type of knowledge that we've been using in climate change would hopefully be helpful. Just a little bit about how the UK does science diplomacy. So we categorise it broadly in 3 areas. So it's science in diplomacy, science for diplomacy, and diplomacy for scientists. So just to give a few examples here, so science in diplomacy, we do a lot of work on climate change, antimicrobial resistance. Science for diplomacy, that's where maybe we perhaps don't have the best relationship with certain countries, but scientists do. So we work then with scientists to keep open some of those communication channels. And then a lot of work that I do as well is on the sort of diplomacy for scientists. So how can we create the right conditions that enable global collaboration between our research communities? And I think also there's an interesting element there, which is slightly newer perhaps, which is how do we ensure that that collaboration is safe and secure? So a little bit more context, we have the UK's integrated review, which puts science and technology at the heart of both prosperity and security. We have the UK Science and Innovation Network, which I'm part of. So I cover Europe, Turkey, Russia, and Israel, and have a team of about 35 in that region, but there are 4 of me around the world. And that's relatively unique. So lots of other countries do have sort of science counsellors as part of their diplomatic service, but they don't necessarily have a dedicated sort of science network on the scale that the UK does. And I would say that our work is very, very broad. And maybe this is more relevant to the webinar you had earlier in the week, but I think that COVID for my network has really shown the need for investment in long-term relationships, expertise, and the need to sort of share knowledge extremely rapidly, but in a very uncertain and fast-moving world, which the pandemic has been over the last year. So just to sort of finish, because I'm conscious of time, I think a few of the challenges that I've sort of seen, and this is not necessarily in order of importance, but I think as a practitioner, sometimes interacting with academics, there's been that sort of language barrier, and sometimes there's a feeling from the practitioner perspective that the work or the research that's being done isn't practical enough to be used on the ground. And I think that sometimes, I'm not saying that necessarily that is wrong, but I'm just saying that sometimes that can be a challenge when you want to make sure that knowledge is moving from the sort of academic side to the more practitioner side. And I think Felicia raised this already, is the sort of language barriers. So here, I don't mean sort of, speaking different sort of languages, not English or anything else, but just different communities have different language. So when you're working on climate change, the way in which you talk and the acronyms you use is very different to working on another subject area. And I think all groups and communities have their own form of language, but it can mean sometimes that you talk at cross purposes when you're trying to, say, bring climate change into the military field, that can sometimes cause issues. And I think the timescales here, particularly in climate change, are a huge challenge. So I think Felicia already referred to sort of needing the political will. And I think we do need to remember that political cycles tend to be relatively short. The US is always a good example where it's sort of 100 days or possibly a year or 18 months before the sort of next election is coming up, even if it isn't the presidential one. But the time and the commitment that we need on climate change is, it's now, but it is also 5 years and 10 years and 50 years, and that mismatch of timescales can be quite a challenge. And I think looking from my own perspective is that sort of generalist versus specialist point, and how when you're doing diplomacy, how do you ensure that you've got the right balance in your diplomatic service between generalists, which I am, and specialists who have the depth of knowledge that you might need on a particular subject. And I think we all suffer from this. My inbox certainly is not a happy place. It's just the volume and how you sift through to make sure, and how you sort of get your piece of information to sort of punch through, given how much information there is out there, some of it which is really useful and some of it which it's not, when we're all very busy. So that is a very quick canter through. I hope that that was helpful and that elicits some questions.
Thank you so much, Francis. That was very telling, and I think having that practitioner perspective is really valuable as a scholar, making your research accessible and impactful amongst the practitioner community, however that's manifest, is really one of the real benchmarks in my humble opinion. And I think the way that you've spoken there about the things that, as it were, both sides can do to talk to each other more effectively, to be practitioners of diplomacy, whatever the subject matter, is really, really valuable. So thank you for that. If we may now turn to our third speaker, Mathieu.
Thank you very much, Simon. I will now share my computer, my screen. Here it is. So thank you very much, Simon. Thank you very much, everyone, for allowing me to share some thoughts with you on recent evolutions or trends in science diplomacy. What I'm going to try and do is to map what international science organizations do with respect to science or knowledge diplomacy, how they contribute to science diplomacy, trends, as I said, and along the way, obviously reflect a little bit on the specific role of the International Science Council. As Simon mentioned, my name is Mathieu Denis, and I'm Science Director of the International Science Council. So I don't know how much you know about the Council. I suspect not a lot. Perhaps it's enough to say that we're a membership-based organization, that we represent all of science at the global level, so natural, social, human sciences. And our mission, indeed, is to be the global voice for science. Now, focusing more on the topic of today's discussion and building on the well-known taxonomy on science diplomacy that Francis, you've also just used now, one can try and situate the role of international science organizations in the global picture of science diplomacy by distinguishing between science for diplomacy on the one hand and science in diplomacy on the other. So looking at science for diplomacy, I think the point that I want to make is that at the very core of our work as international science organization is the promotion of scientific cooperation to support scientific or knowledge diplomacy. We do that through, if you want, our broad membership. So we bring together different types of members, different type of actors in science systems, and national members such as academies of sciences or research councils, as well as international members representing the different disciplines. And so in between national members, of which we have 140 something, or that we have in 140 something countries, and the international disciplinary unions and associations, we have about 220 members. We're trying to bring all of these members and perspectives together and defend joint views on the role of science in different areas, including science diplomacy or knowledge diplomacy. Obviously, there are tensions, and we try and address those geopolitical tensions between members, between countries, through the notion of universality of science. And our organization has a longer history, and during the Cold War was one of the few international organizations where actually there was an active and ongoing collaboration between countries from East and West. And today when there are tensions, for example, US, China, we're still trying to bring everybody in joint science initiatives. Moving now to science in diplomacy. Let me try and, like that. That refers to our action to inform policies on issues that cannot be dealt with by individual states. So these are the so-called global priority challenges. Think about pandemics, think about climate change, that is the focus of today's discussion. Think about sustainability. And so the ISC has a role here, again, through, or different roles in trying to really inform those global policy processes. For instance, we sponsor something like 15 or 17 global international research programs, like the World Climate Research Program that informs the work of the IPCC, or the Global Climate Observing System, that is also very critical for providing the science for the COPs. But we sponsor programs like that in different areas, not just climate or sustainability, also in data science, around inequalities, around issues of around urbanization, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one type of action that we do, the co-sponsorship of international research program. We also drive our own priority project as an organization. We've run projects on looking at SDG interactions. We do a lot of work around social transformations to sustainability. So making sure that the social sciences are involved and provide knowledge informing the global policy processes. We have a big project with the UN Development Program at the moment on rethinking human development, looking at indicators, et cetera, project around COVID as well. And we try and develop strategic action to convene funding community to come together and fund the kind of science that is needed to inform science diplomacy or global policy processes. And that's one of the key point that Felicia made during her talk. And we do that with the programs as well, because there's not a lot of discussions across issues. Now we know that programs working on oceans, programs working on climate, et cetera, need to talk more. And so we do that as well through an initiative called the Global Sustainability Leadership Initiative, making sure that those programs contributing to science diplomacy processes speak to one another. But leaving aside from the science in, science for diplomacy taxonomy for now, I will also want to mention that international science organizations, including my own, play a pivotal role in the multilateral system to integrate science in the big consultation and global policy processes. We do that by doing different things, by representing science in some of those in the big meetings, by raising awareness, playing an advocacy role on specific issues, and by providing inputs, both solicited or unsolicited, to specific processes and conferences. So, a lot of that has to do with, a lot of it is around the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, the Sendai framework for risk assessment, but recently around COP26. So Francis, I don't know if you're aware of that, we were called upon to help develop the call to action that will be published, that will go out for science and higher education. It's an example. And so there are several mechanisms where we play different roles. We represent science in a major group. We are part of advisory bodies. We run joint activities with UN agencies. We run INCSA, a big international network of government science advice. And we run our own, outreach advocacy campaign. So it's just to say that, we're trying to convene the global scientific community and making sure that we are being active and well represented in those processes. Effective science diplomacy is served by strong international scientific collaboration. That's the axiom of our work. And therefore there's significant efforts that need to go into strengthening science systems in all parts of the world. And the issues that need to be addressed here, they're well known. They're hardly, I think they're going to hardly come as a surprise to all of you. They're about big global knowledge divides, something, Felicia, I think you mentioned, between different countries, different parts of the world. They're about equal access to knowledge. They're about ongoing fundamental digital transformations of science. They're about the emergence of new ways of doing science that engage directly with stakeholders in the co-construction of the knowledge. They're about the inadequacy of research incentives that value new knowledge, public and academic journals, but not the more solutions-oriented research that targets specifically the challenges such as climate change that we're discussing today and could feed into science diplomacy processes. They're about threats to scientific freedom, threats to understanding of science. Think about climate change denialism. And they're about barriers to global scientific collaboration. We've seen that during COVID, for example, with the issues around vaccine nationalism. We see that again currently, US, China, so there are potential barriers to global collaboration. And that's my last slide. It's difficult to assess how these, what I've shared with you, those issues, they map to a certain extent current issues that the ISC and other international science organizations are dealing with. They're trying to tackle, if you want. It's difficult to assess how things will evolve, obviously. As always, there are contradictory trends. But if you look, for example, at current developments in open science, in open access, in digital transformation, in engaged science, one could argue that they point toward a more transparent, more collaborative, a more global process of science production feeding into science diplomacy processes. So perhaps we are seeing the emergence, and I'm trying to be prudent, but seeing the emergence of something like a science diplomacy 2.0. That's one possible current trend. Equally, we may be assisting to a growing recognition from different states, a growing recognition that threats to scientific interpretation and understanding and barriers to global collaboration, scientific collaborations are an area for joint interventions. In other words, are areas that require more joint interventions because there are potentially impeding positive development at the level of science, at the level of diplomacy, diplomatic efforts. In other words, they may be emerging as priority areas for diplomacy for science. That's an assessment, putting that on the table for our discussion. And Simon, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. That was wonderful. Again, some fascinating perspectives shared by, obviously a practitioner and expert in this realm who's doing the work of science diplomacy. So we now have the opportunity for some questions, and I see that we have a couple in the chat, but please do feel free to send them around. I'll see one from Nicholas Watts. Thank you, Nicholas. Do you, this I think possibly aimed a little bit to Felicia, but could be to others as well. Do you have any sort of projections regarding the relative interests of developing versus research-rich countries compared to countries which are dominant in finance? I.e., is there a discourse or disjuncture perhaps between those who have, as it were, perhaps the assets and some of the attributes of climate finance, and those who have established financial positions in the world? I wonder if that's something that you might like to just share. And then also I see a comment directed more towards Francis, so I'll give Felicia a moment to think. Do you see a role for power diplomacy, something that I've spent some time working on, forms of diplomatic actor other than the nation state, where is the opportunities for that to come to bear in this space? Universities are one, cities are another that I mentioned there. Where else do you see, the importance of sort of interlocutors in this space? And perhaps that speaks also to Matthew's point about a science diplomacy 2.0. If you're not just talking to lab coat wearing scientists, but who else are the people who are part of this? And forgive me the caricature. I'm a bespectacled academic. I fit another caricature. So Felicia.
Yeah, so I saw your question because I wasn't quite sure what you meant about projections about relative interest, because obviously there is the existing dynamic of developing nations that require finance and developed nations that have finance. That's what the arguments are about 100 billion a year that hasn't yet been achieved. But if you're talking about the particular project that I'm working on, that's specifically targeted at developing relationships with domestic universities in developing countries. The idea being that it's realistically only by building up self-owned, self-contained, jointly created knowledge base that you can effectively change the way things work. You can't walk in and say, well, you should do things like this, because that's just A, completely unacceptable, B, never going to work because nobody likes to be told what to do, and C, pays no attention whatsoever to the very specific differences between countries. So one of the things that was particularly interesting in the project that we did was actually working with local academics to work out what were the most useful elements of the educational program given the core concerns and interests in the particular country. So for example, Katia in Costa Rica is a specialist and works across South and Latin America in agriculture and forestry. So there are very different models of financial concern in different countries. At the same time, a lot of the academics are working with local and regional banks, the GCF, all sorts of different climate related funding bodies to develop new mechanisms. And what you actually get to do is share that between the different groups. So I hope that answers your question. If not, please flag it up and I will try to discuss more about the relative relationships between developed and developing countries to do with climate change and climate finance.
Thank you, Felicia. Francis, if I may.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Nicholas, for your question. I think it's a really good one. I mean, I think it's prompted quite a few thoughts, so I might expand a bit more on your question. I hope that's okay. I mean, to start with, really, diplomacy is no longer the preserve of diplomats, if it ever was. So I think that having multiple actors, particularly in something like climate change, which requires action at all levels of society, from government down to the individual, that I think it's really important that you have lots of people essentially talking and sharing best practice on how you take action. And I think that the C40 initiative is a really good one to kind of illustrate that example of what you need to do at a city level. And also, I think it's really important in diplomacy that you think about who the right messenger is. To use an example from my own career on climate security, at the time I was relatively young, talking to militaries around the world, and I wasn't necessarily always the best or most credible messenger. So I roped in a rear admiral from the Ministry of Defence who had 17 uniforms, and he was a pretty credible messenger talking about military risk to people who are also in uniform. So I think that's an important thing in diplomacy, is really thinking about, you know, what message are you carrying, what's the knowledge, but also who the messenger is.
Thanks, Francis. That's a very useful example, certainly one that I've seen in, played out in many regards, but in the realm of diplomacy, sometimes those rank and acceptance do make a difference. Mathieu.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Let me pick up on your question about the role of other actors. I think it's obvious. You're absolutely right. We're seeing different actors emerging, coalitions of science actors. I'm talking about science actors, and trying to play a role in different areas pertaining to science diplomacy. We're seeing coalitions of universities. We're seeing coalitions of science academies. I talked about the specific role of research programs. So you're absolutely right about that. What the ISC, my own organization, I think is uniquely placed to do, or the role that it's uniquely placed to play in that whole ecosystem of organizations, is that we are the only truly global, truly interdisciplinary, bringing together all disciplines, neutral, representative global voice for science. UNESCO, which has the big S, cannot play that role because it is essentially an organization of member states. But we're the only science organization made up of science actors and trying to bring everybody together and coordinating neutral, autonomous input into the science diplomacy game. This being said, I'm not saying we're playing that role yet. I'm saying we're uniquely placed to become some sort of go-to for science if that approach of multi-stakeholder participation in the science, the scientific diplomatic effort indeed develops. And that's obviously for us, that's the role that we're trying to play obviously in coordination with everybody else, but it's trying to make sure that at the global level, on those big issues that require interdisciplinary and truly global scientific input, that there is a neutral and representative voice that can speak on behalf of science.
Thank you. I think there's some interesting sort of themes emerging here around the qualities of the diplomacy, the broad-ranging diplomacy of representation, communication, negotiation that we're seeing play out here. I see three more questions, at least in the Q&A. I'm going to attempt to sort of blend them together to give colleagues a chance to answer them. So colleague Imran from Pakistan asks, how will nations deal with higher ambitions for climate plans? What kind of is the China-US dynamic in this? And you might care to have a view on that. I see a former student of mine on the Global Diplomacy Programme, Kumar, welcome, who asks around the role of NGOs and the United Nations structures. How are they playing out, particularly some of those driven by activist activity? The public sort of advocacy for climate change, how might that play out? And then also a question from Dr. Dakhar around how do countries work together? What's the glue that's going to create the coalitions of the willing in this space that you've seen come to pass? So I appreciate there's a lot there. Perhaps Felicia, if I might come to you first to have a dash at those three elements.
I'll certainly have a go. In terms of the higher climate ambition plans, obviously the hope is the sooner the better. There is definitely strong hope that there will be stronger climate ambitions announced this year because of COP, and that's one of the things the UK government is trying to bring together. In terms of what we can expect from the USA and China, again, that's a very complicated question. I'm not sure we have time to go into that in any detail. I certainly think the fact that China has announced a 2060 net zero goal is a huge step forward. It completely transforms the basis of the conversation. And there are expectations actually that China may well bring that date forward to align more closely with the 2050 net zero plans that have been announced by a number of different countries. The challenge obviously with net zero is, what does that actually mean? Does it include offsetting? Is it actually going to be lower emissions? How's that going to work on an industrial basis? I think there is huge potential. I think it's very closely related to the question of, what's actually the glue that's going to bring the coalition of the willing together. And again, I'm obviously biased, but I think one of the things around that is understanding risk and understanding the financial potential cataclysm, quite frankly, if it's not dealt with. If you're looking at the role of NGOs in the UN is very much there to corral states to take action, but politicians give negotiators power, and politicians are the ones who are affected by public perception. Now, whether you agree with activists or not, they change the nature of the conversation. Certainly, there are huge amounts of activity outside the NGO world, outside the UN world. It's not just activists. You know, there's investor campaigns and networks, there's business campaigns and networks, the cities are working together. There are actually representatives in almost every walk of life of people who are coming together to take action on climate change because they recognize how unbelievably important it is to take action. One of the challenges, and where I think diplomacy is so important, is this understanding of the importance of communication, this understanding of the importance of language, and the understanding of how you go about aligning people's interests in a way that means that everyone stays on the same path. Sorry, that was a very quick attempt to answer all of those.
Thank you very much, Felicia. I certainly agree with that latter point about the importance of diplomacy. I appreciate I have a vested interest, but Francis, please.
I'm not sure how I can follow. That was a superb answer covering extremely complicated questions. I think maybe I just pick out one point that Felicia says, that negotiators and diplomats are given their mandate by politicians. So I think there was a point in the sort of introduction text for this webinar, which sort of says, you know, is there a failure of knowledge for diplomats who are going in to negotiate? And actually, I think it is that point that you have to remember, that we get given our mandate by politicians, and politicians get given their mandate by the public. So I think that it's just worth thinking about it in that way, rather than just about the kind of whether the knowledge is sort of making it in the right way to the diplomats.
Thank you, Francis. Mathieu.
Thanks. I don't feel I have much to add. Perhaps on the China-US issue, I think I agree with Felicia. You know, China's commitment was obviously very positive, as was for that particular for the issue of climate, the election of Joe Biden. There are at the same time reasons that, you know, would are less developments that are less positive. If you think about what we saw during COVID, the very fact that, you know, the Security Council was not able to come up with anything meaningful, not a decision, not a dedicated session, is a problem, and it's probably indicative of real tensions and lack of willingness. The question on the role of NGOs and the role of the UN in science diplomacy, I feel I have addressed already. I can perhaps just clarify or repeat that NGOs do have their role. They're absolutely critical in building pressure and making the case for important transformative action. I think so that, but at the same time, there is a lot of science on climate that does need to be translated and brought into the negotiation table. Not to say that, you know, if politicians or diplomats see the science, then they will act. We know that's not in a particular way. We know it's not the case. But we feel that there is, as I tried and started to say, there is a role for a, if you want, science broker at the global level that really try and speak on behalf of science in those and represent the scientific consensus when appropriate and when possible on those big issues. So I think, you know, both have a role. Advocacy has a role, but there's a need also for science brokerage action.
Thank you. I think that leads a point, and again, I'll do my best to summarize some of the questions in the last couple of minutes and give everyone a chance for a sort of final word. But I think the question of leadership, what does leadership look like in this space? You know, whether it is you know, a national premier, whether it's, you know, a nation, whether it's actually a consensus, whether it's, you know, a transnational advocacy group, whether it's, you know, a challenge in other ways, maybe through an NGO network or organizational structure. I think the case of you know, who leads on climate change, these are important questions to recognize, because they will help shape the debate. They're not the only way of thinking about it, and sometimes the, you know, leadership can come from, you know, a teenage girl in a way that we perhaps wouldn't have perspective. But these are, nonetheless very fundamental ways of thinking about, because we have an existing structure which focuses on, people called prime ministers or presidents, and structures that put them in place. I'm mindful that we don't have a lot of time, but I would like to give our contributors, and again take the opportunity to thank them, a final minute, if I may. Felicia, anything as a final word?
No pressure, 1 minute to sum everything up. I'm fascinated by the perspective that Mathieu and Francis have shared, because obviously coming at this from the point of view of an academic on the ground, it's a very different perspective than the practitioners would have. But I think it's very powerful that the one thing everyone seems to agree on is the fact that language and communication and aligning our goals is absolutely fundamental to success. And the different ways in which that happens, and the different ways in which we learn to communicate in different languages of communities, is absolutely fundamental. And I think that would just be my bit.
Thank you. Francis?
I think what's really come out is that you have to present this in a way that is in somebody's self-interest. So why should they act? Why should the politician act? Or, why should the country act? You can't just say it's for the global good. Those timescales are too long. So it's about breaking it down and making it possible for politicians, and therefore civil servants and diplomats, to take action. And that links to the second point, which has come out quite a lot, which is that there needs to be many actors in this field. There needs to be the campaign groups and the scientists and the diplomats. No one group can do this alone, and it's that collective effort that will move us forward, because it cannot be just left to sort of politicians or to diplomats, but it needs to be everybody. Otherwise, we risk. I've been working on climate change for a long time, and I think we have a relatively short window, and we've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go, and so that needs everybody.
Thank you, Francis. Mathieu, your 60 seconds, if I may.
Thanks for that. I very much agree with the 2 points that were just made by Felicia and Francis. I mean, I think we need to recognize, we know from international relations studies, nations act in their own interest, their self-interest. And part of our mandate, joint mandate, part of our challenge is now to explain, convince, educate governments and diplomats that it is in their self-interest, interest of their nations, to address climate change for reasons of global common good, as Francis mentioned. It's not enough, I agree, but there's that. But also because they are directly, otherwise their population are directly threatened by current developments, and they are never going to be able to address and redress the situation by themselves. These are issues that require strong diplomatic, international, in the sense of international efforts. So we do need to educate them. There is an element, to come back to the first point Felicia made, I think, an element of capacity building in that sense. I agree with that.
Well, thank you all very much. Thank you for keeping to time and being as erudite and as thought-provoking as you have been. It's been a real pleasure to host this seminar, and I very much look forward to rejoining this discourse in the autumn, when we will be having 2 more seminars on this subject of knowledge diplomacy, tackling the world's wicked problems as such as they are. So thank you very much, Felicia Jackson, Francis Wood, and Mathieu Denis. Thank you to all of you who have joined us, and take care, be safe.